Welcome to Making It Last, where we share ideas to help families tackle major issues. I'm your host, Regina DeMeo, and with me today is Becky Lee of Becky's Fund, which has been around for 7 years. Thanks so much for being here.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today.
So, can you tell me a little bit about Becky's Fund and how you founded it and the mission?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I started at Becky's Fund in 2006. For some background information, I'm a domestic violence lawyer, so my specialty is family law and domestic violence.
Okay.
And I first started at the University of Michigan and talking about issues of how to advocate for victims of domestic and dating violence. Ended up then meeting someone there who defended battered women who had basically killed their abusers in self-defense, and worked with her over that summer, learning that that's what I really wanted to do, is defend many times these women who often don't have the resources to be able to defend themselves in these situations. Then fast forward, I went to law school, specifically working on these cases through clinics, supporting both men and women, also children, in these situations that often they don't have a voice because they realize that often the sort of stereotypes or stigmas that are attached to saying that you're a victim are often very heavy and very hard, whether it's financial burdens, religious, cultural issues. Many people have difficulty coming forth to get help. And then after law school, I moved out to D.C. And worked specifically on this issue. But I was given an opportunity in 2006 where a casting agent from the reality show Survivor asked me to try out for the show. And so I went on the reality show in 2006, came in third place, and then with the funds from the reality show, I started Becky's Fund basically that year. One of the main reasons why I started the organization was because I saw a lot of different groups focusing on domestic and dating violence from the reactive angle, seeing after a situation has happened and then saying, well, how can we help you? But I saw that, and I know many people see it as well, there are always warning signs. There are always red flags out there. But often, because we don't have the speaking tools, the resources, or the know-how of how to sort of intervene during that cycle before it gets worse, we often don't do anything. And I think also because we have sort of ideas about this is an issue that only affects maybe married couples, this is an issue that's a privacy issue that happens in the bedroom only. I think often bystanders who are both friends or family members don't know how to sort of take that step and say, I can help you, I want to help you, what's going on. So I started the organization specifically to focus really on prevention and education, speaking to students all over the country, to both boys and girls, men and women, about how to recognize these warning signs. And then we also educate young boys and girls as young as 9 years old through Girl Scouts, through different civic organizations, talking about what it really means to be in a healthy and happy relationship. And then obviously from different programs, including financial literacy, we do self-empowerment with self-defense and fitness.
Okay.
And then we also obviously do a lot of awareness and advocacy events, reaching out to people who actually are personally affected.
What are some of the warning signs?
Sure. I think that, obviously there is not one perfect sort of list.
Right.
Everyone is different. But some things such as when someone thinks that, someone's condescending, and, is a repeated pattern of tactical behavior, sort of to put down somebody. And basically it's, when someone tries to basically take away someone else's power and control. So anything simple as, alienated someone from their family and friends, making excuses for whenever they get angry, they lose their temper, saying that you made me do that.
Right.
Being very possessive about the person's time, about the person, what they're doing, who they're hanging out with, and sort of making an excuse, well, if you love me, you would do this for me. Or, if you really love me, you would spend all your time with me. But then also small things. We also see a lot of sort of threatening actions, saying that, if you don't do this, I will tell, your friends all about, that last time that we, hung out, when you weren't supposed to hang out with me. Or if you don't do this, I will hurt the dog. And things that get a little bit more malicious, things like with even married couples or even with people having children, if you don't come back to me, I'm going to pick up, Susie from school that one day that you're not going to know, and then you'll never see her again. So there's a lot of different tactical sort of measures that abusers often use. But different, obviously, to each person, to a teenage girl versus maybe a married woman versus somebody who's an immigrant who maybe is scared because maybe they're here illegally. However, they still have rights. There are things such as the UNT visa that allow someone who's here in the country to be able to stay here, proving domestic violence, in their case. So there's different sort of factors that are always involved, but at the end of the day, really is showing that there's an unbalanced power and control that someone's trying to take away from that person.
That makes sense. I mean, it wasn't until I went to law school that I truly understood the whole cycle of violence, right? I used to think, why is somebody putting up with violence every day? But it turns out there's like 3 phases, right? There's the initial tension building part, then there's usually this abusive incident, and then they actually go through a honeymoon phase.
Right.
So a lot of people, they love that honeymoon phase so much, and it kind of keeps them glued in and dealing with the tension building phase and then these incidents. But the cycle will always continue.
That's very true.
And that for me, that was illuminating to realize that, I can see now why someone would get sucked in.
And what happens also is that I think, again, we talked about this before with media, and how often I think when we do see public sort of quote romances as back as time when we see Elizabeth Taylor and we see these passionate sort of romances where people would fight and they're like, oh, that's such a passionate and love story. They had their ups and downs and then they get back together. So I think again, we typically what we see in movies, what we see in sort of the magazines and stories, we see the passionate sort of turmoil, but we don't see how actually damaging it is, and how often you see the pieces of how damaging it is to self-esteem, to confidence. And so people often think that domestic violence is only the physical piece.
Right.
And so even when talking to people and saying, are you in a healthy relationship? And then asking them specific questions that relate to their mental well-being and their sort of spiritual, emotional well-being, people don't often realize that the relationships they're in are not healthy. But I think, what's so helpful and also so encouraging is that there are resources, there are ways to get out, but then being able to sort of recognize when you're in it, because often when you're in it, your emotions are involved, and so it's harder to sort of understand what you're going through. And so what we really, sort of emphasize is friends and family who see the warning signs to be able to be confident enough to say, like, is everything okay? Maybe I saw that bruise, or I see that you haven't been hanging out, or you haven't been yourself. You're not responding to my phone calls or my texts or my emails, like you used to. Even colleagues, because the statistics show us that 1 in 4 women are affected by this issue.
Wow.
And so we are sitting next to them on the bus, on the metro. We're walking next to them in the hallways of where we work, our social settings. But often I think that because we don't ask those questions, people think, okay, well, if no one asks those questions, they don't really care. And so one time, I had this it was a poignant story when this woman had said to me, I was, standing in a hallway in school, and she was a college student, a junior, and she said, I was fighting with my boyfriend at the time, and it was shocking. I was crying, and he had his finger in my face and pointing at me and very condescending. It was pretty obvious that they were having a pretty bad fight. And she said, my friends walked by, and no one said anything. And what comes down to often, we still blame the victim instead of asking the question where the lens should be, why, where is the accountability for the crime?
Right.
And so she said by everyone walking by, she thought no one cared, but also gave him power because no one said anything. So it gives him power saying that I can do this.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So people often ask, why do you think domestic violence is such a big issue in our culture, in our community? Well, then we often ask, why would somebody stop doing something? And typically it's usually because of repercussions. Right?
Right.
And so how often do boys growing up seeing domestic violence in their house, how often do men, when we see a football player or a famous person get in trouble for domestic violence, how often do we see them going to jail? So I think a lot of it has to do with what we're seeing as sort of the crime and the reaction from the crime, but also the repercussion, how we sort of hold people accountable for the crime.
No, that totally makes sense. And I think, unfortunately, like, when I do my divorce cases, I see a lot of people, they admit that they've had these incidents, but they don't want to actually bring it up because they just want to make the divorce as clean, as uncomplicated as possible.
Right.
So I actually, I hear a lot more unreported cases than, I wish
It's very true.
Yeah, it's very sad.
Yeah.
And these people, like you said, like a lot of times when they're going through divorce, it's further compounded by the fact that they've been alienated from their friends and family, and this person has become like their one connection, and now it's like, oh my God, I have to, if I'm going to leave, start over, right? And sometimes, you can rebuild certain connections, and sometimes you've severed them, and there is no way to reconnect. So it is far more rampant than I think people realize, because obviously not everyone's listening in on my consultations and the stuff that I hear. But I also want to get to the point, like, lately in the media we've had a couple of great cases that are sort of like the Steubenville case. What do you think about how the media's handled that?
I think it's a big eye-opener, seeing specifically how CNN covered the story. Again, in this very, very tragic situation where, where this woman's life is forever changed, and then seeing also the two young men that were involved, and the fact that still as a society, how do we react? We still blame the victim instead of saying, what is the crime that was committed, and, how do we prevent this in the future? Right. And so, I mean, think about it. If women all over the United States, young girls, see that this one young woman still is being tormented on Facebook and, blamed for being in that situation, letting herself get that drunk, etc., then who is going to come forward in the future when they're in that situation, or they have a friend that, sort of in the same type of situation where, maybe not obviously the exact same, party when someone's unconscious gets raped, but even trying to report something that might be very embarrassing, right, and have a stigma attached to it. And so I thought it was very sad, especially because from the CNN reporter who was a female, and having all her attention sort of on look at these two boys' faces as the verdict is read, their lives are ruined. And I think the attention really should have been on the survivor and seeing how we need to support her as she moves forward and as she heals. And I think that sort of tells us a lot about how far we still have to go.
Yeah.
And even seeing past politicians talking about abortion and how, the body will just, reject the child. Things about a lot of misunderstandings, I think, in our culture and our community still about what is correct and how we talk about these issues in the public, but also how do we support women from a women's perspective as well.
No, absolutely. For me, like, my biggest thing is making sure that women do not become so economically dependent on their spouses that later on they have no way of leaving, right? Because I see it all the time. There are these women stuck in very miserable marriages, but they've stuck it out for 10 years, 20 years, whatever, because they don't have the resources to pay for their own house, to leave and get their own, safe harbor, basically, without, crashing at a friend's house or, at a relative's house. And it's very sad, and maybe we're going to have to take a little break, but when we come back we can talk about some of the resources that are available for people who need these kinds of places. Sure. Okay, so we will be right back.
I got no pulse for losing him.
Sergeant, he's in VFib.
Shock him.
Guys are real all the time. You just had a few drinks. This can't be happening.
Are we clear?
Clear.
You're just buzzed.
Just buzzed. You didn't tell us that, sir. You're right. This isn't happening. He'll be fine.
I feel good.
Really?
No, not really.
Buzz driving.
Clear.
Maybe we should stop acting like it's no big deal.
Shock him.
Welcome back to Making It Last, where we share ideas to help families tackle major issues. I'm your host, Regina DeMeo, and with me today is Becky Lee from Becky's Fun. Thanks so much for being here, Becky.
Thank you.
So I wanted to cover resources because I don't think enough people know all the resources out there. And what I see a lot, this is just my own experience with divorces, is that the first thing is people say, well, is there a way to get this person out of the house? And the answer, of course, is yes. I mean, maybe I take it for granted, but I think it should be common knowledge at this point. You can always call 911 if you need help, right? And if you go to the courthouse, there's a whole domestic violence section, and there's people that are there to help people fill out forms. You can go in front of a judge at any point and swear under oath that there is a situation at home that you're afraid of, and with the other person not being there, they will issue a 7-day order. It can only go for 7 days because the other person's not there to defend themselves. But for 7 days, you will have the protection of a court order saying this person has to stay away from you. And then you go at the end of the 7-day period in front of a judge with the other person now there to present their side of the case. And the court's going to have to decide, is this a situation that really requires a longer period of time to stay away, whether it's 6 months or a year, and that would be your protective order. And as part of that protective order, some of the things the court can do is issue emergency alimony and emergency child support, and a custody order that would say, well, the transition for the kids has to be at a neutral location. There's all sorts of things that the court can do if people just pick up that phone and go to the courthouse. But maybe not enough people know about those resources. I mean, what are you seeing?
So those are such amazing resources that are available, but like you mentioned, often when people are sort of in that frantic mode, which is often the phone call that we get saying, I just left the house with one bag of some clothes and some things, I don't know what to do. Ideally, when we're working with our clients, we been talking to them for maybe 5 or 6 months, a couple weeks at least, building a safety plan. And so people can actually come to our website and understand what a safety plan is, which asks questions such as, how does your abuser have access to blank XYZ? Learning how to change your passwords when you're trying to leave to all your different accounts, understanding maybe having a secret password that if there is an altercation or something that happens at your house, maybe your neighbor will know if one curtain's down, one curtain's up. So there's a lot of different things that you can do to help a client help somebody before they leave. But like you mentioned, a lot of times when people are leaving, they're leaving in that instant, couple hours that you have to help that person. And so we ask them, reach out to us, call us, check out our website. There are so many different resources. There are advocates in every single city throughout the coalition. There's a Maryland coalition against domestic violence. There's a D.C. coalition against domestic violence. Usually every state has their own coalition. And once you make that phone call, there's usually a hotline as well. That's 24 hours. You can find the resources that are available in your city, in your area. But what's really interesting...
By resources, you mean like
shelter,
okay.
counsel, referrals to a lawyer. One of the biggest issues that people often, when they first call, is they're trying to get out, right? And so there are typically shelters that have waiting lists, but if you're able to sort of give your case on what's happening, where you're looking to go, you're able to show sort of where you live and showing proof of sort of residency, you're able to then get those resources. And so I've worked with many different organizations, local, also national, that if you make that personal phone call, which is the hardest part usually for many of these people, because admitting, yes, I'm in this situation, I need help, that's number one. And due to the fact that they're scared, they're embarrassed, maybe that they have isolated friends and family, so they feel very alone. And so making that first phone call really is crucial in being able to start that process of figuring out how to get out and leave safely, but also permanently. Because often people who do leave and don't have a plan, you end up going back, and that then attack and that whole situation with the abuser is that much more worse, having to come back.
Interesting. So have you seen people who maybe when you're developing the safety plan, right, and you're suggesting that they go to a shelter, they're like, well, I'm sorry, like I'm used to living in my house in Potomac, right? I'm not going to go live in a shelter. I mean, there are some economic realities that may be a little, unpleasant to certain people that are used to a certain lifestyle. Do you encounter that?
Yeah, so a lot of times with those type of clients, knowing that in their mindset they already have sort of this understanding or a stereotype of what a shelter looks like. Many of these shelters are funded from, the government, funded from the city, from the state, and they have childcare. They have, chefs there. It's great resources where, because of the funding, they're able to basically make a shelter just like your home.
Wow.
But aside from that, really a big piece of working with these clients is helping build their sort of self-esteem, helping build up their resources. And so ideally if I have time, 6 to 8 months or how many weeks working with that woman or that man, I'm basically having them as they're every single week maybe pulling a piece from their check, from their weekly check or their monthly check, and maybe stashing in an escrow account or something sort of privately. So building their nest egg, so that when they are ready to leave, when they have their resources and the finances in check, at least have maybe that 1 month's for rent for an apartment or for a place, they're able to leave. And so obviously a lot of times when working with these survivors, trying to figure out on their sort of relativity, figure out what makes them comfortable, figure out when would they be ready, because often a big question that people often say is, well, I've tried to help him or her leave so many times. And there's a statistic that says that it takes somebody 7 to 9 times to permanently leave an abusive relationship.
Wow.
And so if you're not ready, you're going to go right back, right? And so our goal really is to empower survivors to be able to leave when they're ready, at the same time, when we often say, just leave, you should just leave. But really, when understanding at the end of the day that this abuser has taken the power and control away from this survivor. And so our goal, by saying, let's just go, you need to leave now, we're being no different than the abuser because we're not empowering that person, giving back their power and control. So our goal really is to build them back up,
Right.
help them to learn, okay, these are your resources, this is what your finances look like, this is what your monthly expenses with maybe the kids, with your needs, this is what you have saved in the bank, or maybe you don't have anything saved. So let's slowly build that up. Let's also have you maybe talk to a counselor, start taking classes, yoga classes, building up your self-esteem and your mental well-being. We also have both financial consultants we work with at Northwestern Mutual, also at TD Bank. And also we have fitness instructors that we've been working with over the last 7 years. Everyone from yoga to self-defense to different, like even kickboxing and martial arts.
Right.
And so people often don't realize, people who have never been in this situation, how many other things in your life get sort of torn down and broken down. And sort of building that person back up is a process. And so usually, obviously, when someone does call and say, I need to leave right now, we do call the different shelters, help them get the resources, help them figure out what's available. Maybe if their shelters are all full, helping them get into that hotel for that one night, at least to get away from the dangerous situation. But there definitely are resources available, so we encourage people, make that phone call. Have the courage, have someone help you, but there are resources out there, but you have to make that first step, in asking for help.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And I mean, I think it's fascinating to me when I see somebody who's like, they have like millions, okay, and yet the one person, the economically dependent person, doesn't have their own credit card. They have an allowance, whether it's a man or woman, I've seen both. They're given a certain allowance for the week, and they don't know how to access any of the accounts, or the accounts aren't even in joint names. And so, I'm sitting here, I don't even know how we're going to get them divorced because they don't have any access to funds, and they have to go and ask for help from other people because they can't access what should be marital funds. So it's fun. I think it affects all levels of society, and it affects all economic parts of our society, not just the poor or the working poor. I mean, it's rampant, and not enough people are courageous enough, like you said. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to finally say, I'm going to make this drastic change.
And so we teach that. We even teach that with our youth program and with our young women. It's called Becoming Your Own Heroine. And one of the pieces is financial independence, and saying maybe, in your own family you don't get an allowance yet, or you don't really talk about money because, a lot of times parents think that kids are too young.
Right.
But we teach it at a very young age, saying financial empowerment, it's critical to your success in your lives. You never want to be dependent on anyone, As obviously children, you depend on your parents, but then, if you can even learning what it means to save money and what are needs versus wants,
Right.
And as you're getting older, and we also see with our young men, we're working with a group of young men through a football program in D.C., which we got funding from a federal grant, specifically using football and the environment of football and mentorship and coaches to talk to these young men about not everything from power and control, how to respect women, but also, too, what does it mean, again, to be financially independent? And what does it mean to, learn about sort of wants and needs, but also at the same time, power and control? And so it's been interesting working with youth and really trying to talk about that at a younger age and saying that this is something that's very important. Often we're learning what shop and, how to cook, in home ec class.
Right.
But I wish that, high schools and middle schools even taught young students how to manage a checkbook. I think a lot of those factors then play into later on understanding what finance is and what it means to be financially secure.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And I think you're right. I mean, if you're going to, instead of just be reactive and be more proactive in the beginning, it's about teaching these kids how to manage their own money and have their own money in the event of an emergency. And the relationship piece, I want to go back to that a little bit because, I think you're right. I mean, I see people pick the wrong partners all the time. And so what are some of the things that you do to help people figure out what a healthy relationship is?
Sure.
Do you have counselors involved?
So we have counselors. We have obviously therapists who've talked to someone after they've gotten out of this bad relationship. But so much of it starts young. I mean, I think that again, looking at how media portrays these romances and portrays positive and negative sort of masculine and feminine role models in our television or in movies, in our magazines. I think that's a place often people look to say, well, that's a role model, that's my role model, that athlete, or that singer, or that star. I think a perfect example when we saw how the whole Rihanna-Chris Brown story, how it blew out of control, but then, Rihanna came out and said, the reason why I am coming out to tell my story is because I realize how many young women look up to me as a role model. And so I think that so much of sort of understanding what a healthy relationship should look like starts at home, and if it's not coming from home, then we should be able to teach these different sort of ideas of what it looks like. And I think that's why we've been doing a lot of our programming, specifically working with youth, because it starts when you're young.
No, I agree. So how do you connect with these schools?
Sure. So we work with many different, obviously, state leaders, politicians, Congress, council members. A lot of them will get us in locally. Often also due to our relationships with the mayors of the different areas, as well as just people who are very active in the community. And so one of the ways that we always ask for volunteer support is by asking people, if you're part of your church or part of your school, like legislature, or within your community, the different groups that, have these opportunities for us to come in and talk to them, talk to your students and talk to your youth about what a healthy relationship looks like, but also not just what it looks like, but the next step being that how to be an accountable bystander, how to be a good friend to somebody. And I think one of the biggest questions I get at college campuses is both the guys and girls saying, I know both the abuser and the person who's being abused. What do I say to them? So we see it. I mean, if the statistics say that 1 in 4 women are affected, we are seeing it, but we often don't know what to do.
Right.
So one of our sort of main teaching tools is talking about the language, the resources, but the ways that you can have this conversation with somebody. Obviously talking to the abuser differently than you talk to someone who's being abused. But at the end of the day, having no judgment, it's all about saying, I'm here to support you. I'm also bringing this uncomfortable topic up because I care about you and I want you to get help. How can I support you to get to that next step?
Right. No, that makes sense. So if people wanted to support your organization, how are ways that they could do that?
Sure. So throughout the year, we have several annual events, fundraising events that we have, and people can come to our website to check out what's going on. We have 2 main events throughout the year: Gold Cup and also Walk This Way, which uses professional male athletes standing up against domestic violence. And then throughout the year, we have self-defense, we have financial literacy, but then our free workshops held to help people get back on track with their finances. We also have the different workshops, Men of Code, talking to young men, Becoming Your Own Heroine, talking to young women. And for all these different programs and workshops, we're always looking for volunteers to come out and help serve the kids, also at the same time get involved. Also, through our direct services, we're always looking for advocates that get trained to help direct services, whether it's taking somebody, walking them through at the courts so they're not alone, helping them get their groceries after moving into a new place, after leaving. I mean, there are many different ways. I think that people often don't realize that, many of these people are people that we know, and they live the same, very similar lives. And so at the end of the day, we all need support through the different sort of things that we need to go through our lives. And so there are many different ways, and people can visit our website at www.beckysfund.org to find out more.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks so much for being here today.
No, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on Making It Last.